my thought is that, like a lot of people want to make vessels with coils and things, and that's awesome. If you can coil build a shoe, you can coil build a vase, because this is going to be a lot more complicated structure than the vase. And so as long as you're kind of doing this, I feel like a vase will be that much easier. Though it has its own challenges, right, to get things everything even, but it's definitely something that with this skill set with the shoes, you'll be able to do this with mini forms. Okay, so to begin, just like with our solid built shoe, I made myself a little footprint, but this time I made sure that I really defined where that negative space was going to be. So essentially what's going to happen is that we're going to have a base, and then we're going to add coils, and it's going to be hollow the whole way up. And so we want to make sure that we have our negative space already planned out, because we're not going to be able to pick these things up as easily and like cut away material at the bottom. So making sure it looks like kind of like one of those little dancing footprint things. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? No? Okay. Yes, no. Don't worry about it. You want a footprint where the negative space is drawn out. So again, I just traced out my foot and or the foot of my shoe, and then defined where this negative space is, and went over it with Sharpie so that I can see it clearly. How's everyone's wedging going? I see small nods and no nods. How are my no nod people doing? Are you just tired? Let me know if you're not feeling comfortable with it. Because the further we get into this, especially when we get to slabs for our next project, we really want to make sure there's no air bubbles. You never want air bubbles, but making sure that you're feeling more confident about this when we start rolling out larger slabs. Okay. So what you're going to do, kind of just like with your test tiles, I want you to kind of make a slab. You can use a rolling pin. I like just throwing it on the tabletop. You want these to be the same thickness as your walls, and so everyone's pinky is slightly different, but shooting for kind of pinky thickness for your walls. I don't want to see walls that are this thick. It's going to be the heaviest shoe ever. So really kind of go anywhere from here to here, right? I feel like that's within the realm of everyone's pinky thickness. You do not want any potato chip thin walls. When we get to the top next week, or at least in my demo, I'll talk to you all about how to make an optical illusion for thinner edges while the walls still are thick enough to be strong. So I'm just going to make a slab on the tabletop, throwing it out until it is approximately pinky thickness. So you can see it has like all these wrinkles. It needs to be compressed, so making sure I take my metal rib and smooth this out, because this is going to be the base of my shoe. And you want to make sure that you have a nice strong base so that your shoe doesn't crack apart. You have good base for those walls. Alright, so now you can see it's nice and smooth on this side, so I'm going to flip it over and do the same, so that any weird little air pockets are getting squished together, all those little clay particles are getting close together, nice and strong. Okay, so if looking at my footprint, I have this whole section here, so I'm going to roughly cut out something that's maybe a little bit bigger, and then I can trim it down once I have it on my newsprint. So grab my knife, and I want a slab that's going to be roughly big enough for both sections of my base, so I don't have to make multiple slabs. All right. So I just have this kind of general shape, and then what I can do, if it's slightly short on one side, I can gently pat it and stretch it. And then what I'm going to do is just kind of take a peek and start slicing this until fits basically the stencil that I just made for myself. I suspect you'll take a little bit more time and care with this. I'm just, for the sake of time, moving a little bit quicker than I did yesterday when I was making my demo piece. All right, so you can see that's roughly, it's pretty darn close. Like this spot's a little bit short, but I can gently squish it just enough to make it fill that out without it really compromising the thickness. So again, this is like pinky thickness. So your walls for this, when you go up, should be the same thickness as the floor. There's probably gonna be moments where they differ slightly. As long as there's like a gradual transition between the two different wall thicknesses, it shouldn't be an issue. But you definitely, especially down low, don't want your walls to be that super thin and then you end up putting a lot of weight on it. That's going to be a cranky wall. In general, with coils, you really want to make sure that you time things right, because if you move too fast, the soft clay, before it sets up and you keep putting weight on it, it's going to fail. It's going to give way. When I was in beginning, I was coil building this really massive like horse head, and was working on it, and I had the whole, it was the neck, the head, and up into the nose, and I just had that section of the nose, like the muzzle, to go. It was due on Tuesday, and I've been in here Friday night, all day Saturday, came in Sunday morning, and the whole thing had collapsed onto the floor because I had worked too fast. And so I don't mean to like completely scare you with coils, but it's really important that you listen to the clay, and that will make more sense here in a moment. What ended up happening is I had to rebuild the horse head that Sunday, built solid. It was the first time I ever built something solid. Alana had given us the option to build with coils or solid, and with her demo, when she cut up her example, I thought it was insane and scary, and I didn't want to do it. But then out of necessity to make the deadline, I had to build it solid, and I ended up falling in love with it. So you never know what's gonna come out of, don't get me wrong, I was sitting there crying thinking, how am I gonna get this project done in time? But yeah, you just have to make sure that you plan your time, listen to the clay, and not wait to the last minute. So I'm introducing the coil portion a little bit sooner than I have in some past semesters, because my hope is that you guys will kind of dance between the two to really make sure that we don't have any, and this is a much smaller scale than the horse head too, but you still want to listen to the clay. So my hope is that you can kind of dance between the two so that you end up making that deadline with minimal stress. Okay. So I have my little footprint here. So now I'm ready to actually make coils. Now, unless you are doing a little detail, I do not want to see anyone building their walls with a dinky little coil. You're gonna be here until I was gonna say December, this is spring semester. You're gonna be here until May building these things. So don't try building your walls with these tiny little coils. If there's moments where you have to get a little detail in, that's fine. This is not efficient. So what I want you to do is, even though I said pinky thickness, I want you to make pretty generous coils. So you can take a lump of clay and use the table just to kind of start making a bit of a blocky rectangle. And then you can roll them out on the tabletop. And it's gonna get to a point where you can't really control them. So I always want you to make sure that you are rolling out coils that you can control, meaning that you're not over here rolling one side while the other side is just sitting there, because you're gonna end up getting really weird thin spots. So making sure that you can move your fingers along the coil, and if that means you pinch a little bit off, that's fine. You don't have to have a coil that goes along the whole perimeter of your project. you can go part way, stop, make a new coil, and attach it. That's perfectly fine and expected. So I can keep rolling out on the tabletop, probably in the way that if you used coils before or messed around with Play-Doh or something, you can certainly do this until you get a coil around like this size. You can also use the tabletop to kind of shape it a little bit. So if you want to kind of square it off, you certainly can. That's also going to kind of help compress the things. And then now you have this like nice wall that's going to be pretty strong. This is still a little on the thick side, but we'll get to that. The way that I think is most effective to make coils is the way that Alana makes coils. And so if you're familiar with Alana's work, if you're not, you should Google her. She's incredible. She coil builds all of her animals, all of her projects. There is a life-size moose in the Anchorage Museum. She coil built that thing in here. Had a big armature to help hold it up. She sawed it into pieces, fired it in her gas kiln in pieces, and then epoxied it back together. So the way that she makes coils is that she is using her hands to kind of pinch. And so what this is doing is it's also kind of adding some compression. And so you're basically kind of using your hands to kind of extrude out a coil. And then of course this is pretty rough, so you're welcome to kind of start that way and then kind of soften them on the tabletop. But did you see how quick that was? If you ever have an opportunity to watch Alana coil build, it's insane. She's just like a blowtorch, and she's just, she's incredibly skilled. So I hope you all make it to intermediate to learn from a master of how to make coil build. I'm okay, but she's really good at it. Okay, so I have this coil here. This is pretty massive, so I can just again squish it down a little bit, make it a little bit thinner, and use that tabletop to kind of make it a little bit more smooth. But you see how my hands are spread out, and I'm not just staying in one spot. All right, there's a little bit of a clay nugget in there. All right, so I have this pretty massive coil, but that's good because what we're gonna do is when we go to add it, we're gonna kind of pinch to kind of get more of our wall thickness. But this way we can cover a lot of real estate. So what I'm going to do is I have my fork. You really gotta get a fork for this. Otherwise you're gonna spend half your time trying to score. So I'm going along the edge of my shoe. Constantly dipping in water. I'm using water right now because this is all fresh clay. I'll grab some slip because I have the one I started yesterday. I'll kind of show you when it gets a little bit firmer, grabbing some reclaim slip, so kind of the liquidy bits out of the back is a good idea just because it ends up acting a little bit more like a glue. When the clay's fresh and soft like this and you're just adding water, it kind of creates its own slip, but if things are a little bit firmer, it's better to get some of that reclaim on there. If things are looking a little bit dry, and that's what happens with these coil built shoes. Because these are hollow forms, they dry out really fast. I've had people have to start over. So really make sure you cover things super well, especially if you might not be here for a few days. All right, so I've scored the whole edge, and so it's really rough, it's really ugly, it looks a little bit like Velcro. Then I'm gonna come along the edge of my coil here, and I'm gonna do the same thing, really rough up that edge. And there is some sort of negative space that's created by scoring it, but the hope is that you get enough moisture in there and you compress it that everything squishes together and it interlocks, right? So it's really important that you attach these things really well. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, great. It's okay if you do have questions. All right, so I have my coil, it's all scored up. So I'm going to pick an end. I'm going to set it down. As I set it down, I'm pushing down and I'm kind of squishing in. I kind of almost think of it almost like sewing or stitching this thing on here. But as I'm squishing it, I'm also thinning out my wall to the appropriate thickness, that pinky thickness. Now I have this gap here, and because I have a pretty low profile for my shoe, I'm just gonna jump it. If you've got a really high-heeled boot, I think, Danielle, yours, you'd probably have to do a loop around before you hopped over. We can individually talk about everyone's shoes, but I'm basically gonna bridge this gap and come over here. Again, I'm pressing down and in because this is a pretty meaty coil and our boots don't need to be that. Now I've hit the other end here, so I'm gonna pause and I'm going to score and then keep going. Okay, and then I've got this guy. I wouldn't necessarily recommend rolling out a whole bunch of coils because they end up getting dry. I made this one a few minutes ago, so I'm gonna use it, but kind of make coils as you go. I've seen people have a bunch of coils already made and then they get kind of dry and chunky, and you want, especially when you're starting out and everything's fresh. All right, so I've scored that one. And then right where I started, I'm gonna go back and score all along this edge again, just so that way, once I have that big coil in my hands, I'm not having to pause and score every 5 seconds. Okay, and then I'm also, because this is kind of a leading edge here, I'm gonna score the sides here too. So wherever there's a connection happening, I've scratched at it. And I'm also going to just, because this guy was sitting here for a few minutes while I made the other coils and attached it, I'm just going to use a damp paintbrush to get a little bit more moisture on there. All right, and then begin again, right where I stopped. So if you end up not making it all the way around, that's totally fine. Now, right now I'm just doing coils straight on top, so if you need to go vertical, the coil goes straight on top. If you need to come in, you need to cheat your coil in. With the toe here, what I can do is I'll bend it in here. If you need to go out, you need to cheat the coils to the outer part of your lower wall. It's okay if you kind of start vertical, because then what you can do, because looking at the profile, this is already needs to start coming in. So even though I started vertical, I can gently pinch and round this to start getting my toe. And so in a similar way with our solid built ones, there's going to be a moment where it's going to look kind of rough and blobby. But you can see how pinching in, I'm starting to round my toe. I also need to come back in here, and wherever there's a seam, I need to blend that so it's not a weak spot. So having your non-dominant hand on the inside of that wall and grab your rib is a great tool. And you can come in here and really start smoothing this out and making sure those seams are nice and blended, because there are some pots out there that people choose to leave the coils, but we want to make sure that even though the surfaces between these two shoes are going to be different, the build should be as identical as possible. That's the goal. With coils, people tend to stretch things out, so really make sure you're moving slow enough to check in on your profile that things aren't growing out. And then what I'm going to do too is on the inside with my finger, I'm going to smooth out along the bottom and then along these edges too with my thumb, just so it's nice and smooth. We're going to talk about this more about when we're hollowing out our solid ones, but it's really important to have like pretty insides, relatively speaking. It's not just aesthetically, it's if you're smoothing things out from the inside, your walls are that much stronger because things have been compressed from both sides. All right, and then I would continue smoothing along. Now I have this weird gap in here that I need to close off. So what I can do is I can just put some coils in there to seal it off. It's a little bit tricky to see, but I will do my best to tilt it up. So you can see how, oh, it's actually pretty sticky. I've scored here and here. I'm just gonna kind of go in here. And I'm also going to score maybe the sides here too. And so what I can do is I can score the bottom and the side of this coil. And I'm just going to bridge that gap. So bottom and side, which is kind of funny talking about a cylindrical thing. And so I'm going to just gently bridge this gap here. And I can either go around in a circle, or what I can do is just lay a couple of logs across here. Again, things sometimes have to get ugly before they get pretty. Same thing for the opposite side. Squish that in there. And then I still have this gap, so I'm going to add a third coil. It's going to be a little bit thinner because I don't want this getting thicker than that pinky thickness. Lay that in there. I don't want to like jam on it because I need that negative space. But what I can do is just blend this with a finger or a tool. You all should have one of these guys. This is a really great tool, especially if you start getting into tight places. It's like an extension of your finger, but it's also just kind of nice because I feel like it doesn't stick to my finger. And then I can get in along these edges too and really smooth out any seams. So that's blended. Now before this gets any higher, I'm going to gently roll this over. Just be really careful because this is a little bit, I need to come in here and smooth this as best I can before I really get invested in the texture of the outside. And then what I can do is kind of squish some clay around to kind of get that profile. I'm not yet worried about my textures. I'm just making sure that structurally everything's been blended and smooth so it's nice and strong. Okay. So it's not the appropriate negative space yet for my shoe, but what I can do is come in here and kind of sculpt and mold and squish up while it's nice and soft to kind of start getting that delineation between the heel and the arch of my foot. But again, it's looking kind of rough right now, and that's fine. So I can come back there because it's still pretty squishy at the moment. I can come back in there and kind of clean that up. So I can keep going with my wall thickness or my wall heights as long as there isn't a lot of wiggle. So this is like an appropriate amount of wiggle to my walls. It can take more weight. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to do one side and kind of show you what happens if you go too fast. Your toes are definitely going to be a section as things are coming into close up. You really need to watch this because those like to sink in if you try to move it too fast. So you want to make sure that you're only moving as much as the clay is willing to go. Does that make sense? So I'll just do a small section. I have another shoe for the next step from yesterday. I just kind of want to show you when to you really need to stop. So I'm just going to put this on there. So that's still okay. And this is a pretty, like when you start going vertical, like if we were building very like straightforward vessels, you can get through those fairly quickly depending on like how big their bellies are. But once things start curving and there's kind of a change in the structure, any sort of undulation, that's when you really have to be mindful. So for example, like I just mentioned, closing off a toe. Okay, that's starting to push it. That's scary. I shouldn't have gone this far, right? So see how wiggly this is? The clay is going to be really sturdy if you take your time. So don't try to wait until like a couple days before this is due. Really take your time with it. So I would only go probably a couple coils at a time because like once I remove this stuff, we're back in stable land, right? So just really make sure that you're not pushing it too much, especially as things are kind of coming in. I could probably go one more coil in here. So does everyone understand what I mean? If you're cheating in, or if you're going in, cheat the coil in. If you're going out, does that make sense? So I didn't see everyone nod their head. So I'm kind of just scoring to the very inner edge of this coil and then bending it in. And even if it's a little bit vertical at first, I can make that attachment and come in and start flattening it. And if things get a little bit too wide, you can definitely come in and dart things, so cut a pie slice out. So if this toe got too wide, what I could do is cut a section out, score those edges, and then zip it in to make it a little bit tighter. So if you find that your shoe's kind of getting out of control, take a stop, cut a slice of pie, sew it back together, okay? Any questions about how to get your coil shoes started? Feel pretty straightforward. So I would recommend getting these started sometime this weekend so that you can maybe take a break from that, but get these started so that these walls can set up. So that this is one I made yesterday, and so you can see this is a lot. It's still it's fairly firm, but what I was able to do is come in here and really kind of sculpt and form the negative space in there. I started planning out the texture. So the thing with coil building is as you move up, you need to go back to the bottom and start getting your details in as you go up. Because if you just go up and you try to come back, things are going to be too dry. So you really have to get your details as you go up, okay? So solid build, you're kind of get your whole form in, and then you start getting details in. As your form is emerging, you have to go back and get those details in. Otherwise, things are going to be too firm to get the textures that you want, okay? You can see in this one that I'm almost ready to kind of close this up. So I'm going to make myself a baby coil because I don't need some kind of load-bearing coil, I guess you could call these larger ones. Oh, I was gonna grab some slip too to show you guys since, so I'm just going back to the reclaim. We're even throwing your excess firm clay. So I'm grabbing all the goopy stuff. So this is basically going to act like a glue. So if your seam that you're about to do is a little bit set up, so maybe it was from the day before, a couple days ago, it's nice to use this to kind of help freshen this up and open it so that this fresh clay sticks better to it. You definitely don't want this to get really dry and then try putting a fresh coil on it, because what's going to happen is it might look like they match up, but as things dry, that fresh piece of clay is going to shrink even more than that bottom piece, and so chances are they're not going to line up. There's going to be a weird seam, and then it might crack there. So really baby those edges as you're working on things. So I've got this line here. I'm going to use some of this slip. I can kind of stick my hand in here as best I can so I don't dent this in. And I'm just, with some on my fork, going to get this nice and gooey. Nice little bed for this little coil. And then I don't need this whole section. I'm basically going to use that much. And then I'm going to kind of have my finger underneath here so it doesn't dent, and squishing that in there. I need to kind of make an attachment point for this tail. So that probably for most of you the challenging part is going to be closing off the toe, because relatively speaking, once you get kind of the ankle section, or if you have kind of a large shaft of the boot, it's basically like a coil and you're more or less going straight up. As you kind of move around, you might have to kind of bend the coils in and out, especially since I have all these wrinkles. So I'm going to have to kind of really pay attention to my coils and kind of squish them as I go up, and make sure that this section is really set up, because once I get to up here, I can, it's a pretty simple form to just go in a circle. All right, so then what I'm going to do, I can use this guide to kind of help support this from the inside so I don't completely dent it. I can come in here with my tool and compress that. And then just like with your solid build, it's totally fine to come in here and add little bits of clay if you scratch them and attach them. So as long as you're not adding like a giant bulbous hunk of clay that's gonna like double your wall thickness, it's totally fine to add a little bit, take a little bit away, just as long as we're not getting really thin sections. Okay? So then I'll just gently, so there's kind of like a weird little dent here. I'm going to add just a little tiny patty of clay that isn't going to add significantly to that wall thickness to cause issues, but aesthetically I need it for the profile to be proper. So I'll just gently add this guy in there. And your fingernail is like a little tiny metal rib. It's really great for smoothing little sections out. And then I might need to add a little bit more, but I'd have to sit down with my shoe and kind of really look at it. Okay, and then just like with with the solid shoe, as after I clean this up, I'll go in there and add those lines that I just showed you on the toe of my other boot. I'll come in with my little eyeball tool and start teasing out, oops, some of the texture here, because there's still a fair amount of meat in a wall that's about pinky thickness that you can kind of play around with. And then if I need to add a little bit of clay, I can certainly kind of score it and add a little bit more material, and I can kind of pinch out some of this texture too if need be. Okay, so basically my hope is that you've kind of started doing some of these details to really help guide you as you come up this one too. Any questions?
What do you do if you mess up your proportions initially? Like you make the toe just too big and you have to remove a bunch of material. Like later, after you've like built out the whole body of the shoe, you realize, oh crap, this toe is gigantic. It looks like a clown shoe. So
it depends on the consistency of the clay. Sometimes you can cut that little pie slice out, like I mentioned. Sometimes you can grab out of our basket out here. This is kind of like an overkill one. But you can also take a paddle and shape things. So especially if it's a little bit firmer and taking a slice out, like it's gonna be too firm to cinch it in. You can use a paddle to kind of help shape things too. My hope is that because we're using the footprint, like really check your measurements as you go up, so that you don't end up with a clown shoe version of your project. But there's ways of cutting sections out, of paddling things to kind of help reshape it.
Do you ever do like combination coil solid? Is that a thing?
It is a thing. I personally don't, because I love solid building. It just makes more sense for my brain. But there's certainly people, if any of you are familiar with Kimmy, she had a sculpture of two figures on a rock, and so I think this rock was pretty massive, so I think she solid built the rock, and then after it was set up, she hollowed it out and then started coiling for figures on top of it. Or there might be every project's different, there's multiple ways to approach building things. So yeah, it's definitely a thing. It's not something I personally use in my own work, but it's definitely been done. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So again, my hope is that your shoe is starting to look a lot more like your original one. I hope that you are starting to work on your coil one this weekend. So what might be good is that if you're feeling pretty far along with your solid built one, maybe starting this one and getting a couple coils up, so getting about this far. And then what you can do, there's lots of weird random hunks of plastic in here, is what you can do is you can just cover up the seam if you're waiting for your walls to set up. So especially if you want to go back and work on details, you can cover up the seams, let this kind of set up. Just make sure you keep checking on it because it is super dry in here. And then you can work on this for a little bit and then pop back and add a few more coils and maybe work on the details before this gets too set up. So my hope is you guys can dance between these two so that they both are kind of making their way towards that deadline. Okay. The other thing is you might want to do when you go to store these, it might be a good idea to keep that seam nice and fresh to still cover that. You can then cover it with a damp cloth like I had and then mummify it because these do dry out way faster than your solid one. Okay? Great. So you can stop recording.